Good afternoon, everybody. I want to welcome you to the latest in our series of ENO Center for Transportation webinars. My name is Robert Puentes. I am the president and CEO of ENO. And let me first begin by wishing you all, hope you all are staying safe and staying healthy and you're getting your vaccinations. I am joined today virtually by Todd Litman. Todd is the executive director and the founder, I believe, of the Victoria Transport Policy Institute in beautiful Victoria, British Columbia. Todd's work is dedicated to developing innovative solutions to transportation problems. Todd focuses on the really hard stuff. He focuses on how transportation decision-making is done. He focuses on how to improve methods and evaluation models and things like that. His research is used worldwide in more than 24 countries on every continent. He says, except Antarctica. So maybe Antarctica is coming next, but all around the world. And he is here today to talk about his new book, New Mobilities, Smart Planning for Emerging Transportation Technologies. There's obviously a lot to focus on given today's policy discourse around the ongoing transportation revolution, especially the advent of new technologies, things from micromobility to shared services, to on-demand services, to electrification and automation. You know, clearly transportation and technology are interrelated, especially in recent years. And Todd's going to make the case that all of these new technologies need to be examined critically, or at least more critically than they are examined today. And after that, we are going to take your questions and comments. So please use the questions function on the webinar website to submit. You don't have to wait until Todd is done to submit questions. You can send them in anytime, and we will take them once Todd is done. So thank you all for joining us here today. And with that, we turn it over to Todd Litman.
Hello, everybody. Greetings from Victoria, British Columbia. Thank you, Robert, for introducing me. We're going to go on a fun adventure today. We're going to explore our transportation future. So let me present my slideshow. And it's talking about the new mobility, smart planning for emerging transportation technologies and services. It's based on my book of the same title. If you are interested in ordering it from Island Press, there's a discount code you can use to get a 30% discount. It's just webinar, capital, all capitals. And I hope that after this presentation, you're inspired to want to find out more from my book. Now, it's fun to think about our transportation futures, and a good starting point is to look back at what people predicted our current transportation system would look like in the past. And so it's really fun to go back and look at the old Popular Mechanics and Popular Science magazines. And as you'll see, about half of the covers of these magazines had to do with transportation innovations. Transportation affects our lives in so many different ways. And in the past, we have experienced many innovations, many benefits from the innovative transportation. So now we're going to be talking about the new mobilities, new transportation services and technologies that are starting to become available. These different technologies and services are at different stages of development. Some are just in the thought or in the development stage, where others are becoming commercially available and are expanding. And they include everything from active and micro modes and bike and car sharing, ride hailing, electric autonomous cars, transit improvemements, aviation innovations, tunnel roads, pneumatic tube transport, commonly the most common known is hyperloops, mobility as a service, telework, mobility prioritization, and logistics management. And these are all emerging technologies and services that are starting to affect our lives and communities. In my book, I evaluate them critically. We ask questions like, how should we evaluate the new modes and services, and what are their real costs and benefits? Who is impacted and what is fair, and who should bear their costs and risks? And how should we integrate them into our transportation system? And which ones should we mandate, encourage, regulate, restrict, or forbid? So in my book, I apply a comprehensive evaluation framework that looked systematically at that applied these questions systematically to the various new modes and technologies. And it raises a number of very interesting questions. Let me just describe one example. A lot of people are excited about autonomous vehicles, and promoters emphasize their benefits. But a lot of those benefits depend on autonomous vehicles having a dedicated lane so that they can platoon, that is, drive several vehicles driving close together at relatively high speeds. So we have to ask, from a public policy perspective, at what point should highway agencies dedicate a lane to autonomous vehicles? And what should those users pay for this privilege? And how should that be enforced? And who is liable if a platoon has a multi-vehicle crash? What is the most efficient and fair way to integrate autonomous vehicles into our road system? Another example is electric vehicles. Most of our transportation emission reduction plans include very significant subsidies for electric vehicles. However, they do present some problems. One is that electric vehicles, because they're cheaper to operate, are likely to be driven more annual miles. So if you had a conventional car, you might drive, say, 10,000 annual miles, but when you get the electric car, because it's cheaper to drive, you'll drive 12,000. And even though they're promoted as zero emission, they're really elsewhere emitting vehicles. That is, there's significant emissions from their embodied resources, the production of the vehicles and the batteries and the production of fuel. And so yes, electric vehicles do reduce emissions by somewhere between 50 and 80% under typical circumstances, but they alone are not a total solution to our pollution and fossil fuel dependency problems. And so it's important to keep those factors in mind. A fun way to look at this is to go back in time and see what previous transportation innovations have done. And so in my book and in my research in general, I've looked at the transition from 1900, when there were virtually no automobiles, to the year 2000, when automobile travel peaked. And you can look at what's the increase in travel speeds and mobility that automobiles provided, but also you can look at the costs. So in 1900, transportation costs were minimal. Most people, their major transportation expenditure was replacing the soles of their shoes. And some people had bicycles, and some people traveled a little bit by rail, but the actual volumes of those modes were pretty small. In order to develop an automobile-oriented transportation system, we needed people needed to buy cars and operate the cars with fuel, and we needed extensive road and parking facilities, and those costs are significant. If you look at it this way, you compare the annual cost per year for vehicles and the infrastructure and some of the external costs that they impose, like traffic congestion and accident risk and pollution emissions. You can see that the walking, bicycling, e-bikes, and public transit have much lower annual costs per capita than automobile transportation or electric cars, taking into account the much higher annual miles driven that somebody who owns a car travels compared with somebody who depends on walking, bicycling, or public transit. So the costs of our previous technological innovations are significant. One way to look at this is to evaluate travel based on effective speeds. That is, the time you spend traveling, but also the time you spend working to earn money for your travel. And when you evaluate travel speeds, the increase in travel speeds that previous technologies provided using effective speed, what you find is that the speed increase was actually much smaller than what's usually described, and it's regressive. Lower income people are forced to spend much more time earning money to pay for their cars than higher income people. So somebody who earns only $12 an hour is spending more time earning money for their car than they're actually spending driving their car. Where using effective speed, walking, bicycling, and public transit are often relatively fast compared with automobile travel, simply because they're more affordable. So that's the foundation of my analysis. Let's look at how they apply to various new mobilities. So in my analysis, I look at active and micro modes, everything from walking to electric bikes and electric scooters. We look at vehicle sharing, so bike sharing and car sharing, and their costs and benefits. Ride hailing and taxi and micro transit, so much more convenient taxi services and shared taxi services of various types. Public transit improvements. There are many ways to make public transit more convenient and efficient and comfortable and attractive. So what's the role of public transit improvements and innovations in our future? Autonomous electric vehicles. Now, this is the category that really is getting the most attention. So I'm going to give it a little bit of, we'll go into a little bit of more detail here. In my research, I look at, I developed what you would call a market penetration rate. We predict how long it'll take for electric and autonomous vehicles to become common in the new vehicle market and then common in the vehicle fleet. Now, optimists have predicted that by the end of this decade, that by 2030, the majority of people will give up their private cars and rely primarily on shared electric autonomous vehicles. But there are good reasons to be a little skeptical of those optimistic predictions. It's possible that the autonomous vehicles will be commercially available but in the next few years. So by 2030, you'll be able to go into a car dealer and buy a self-driving car that will perform under most circumstances what we call level 5 autonomous vehicles, and it will drive you around. But the first generation of these new vehicle technologies is inevitably expensive and has limited performance. That is, there will probably be some circumstances when you program in a destination where your car will say, I can't go there because of heavy rain or snow that doesn't allow our operation, or because your destination is on a unpaved road or an area that doesn't have the kind of mapping, this very sophisticated mapping that I need. And so it's likely to be 2030s, 2040s, or even the 2050s before autonomous vehicles are dominant in the vehicle fleet. And so it's important to be realistic. Now, autonomous vehicles do have many benefits to the user that reduces stress and can provide substantial cost savings compared with a paid taxi driver. And you can be more productive when you're traveling, and it provides independent mobility for non-drivers, say somebody with a visual impairment or something like that. That's great, but they won't be particularly cheap. They probably will be more lower cost than a human-driven taxi, maybe half the cost of a taxi, so below $1 per vehicle mile. But they won't be. They do incur some additional costs. So the additional hardware, and you'll have to subscribe to these very sophisticated mapping systems, and the self-driving taxis will require frequent cleaning and additional maintenance. And so my prediction is that even with autonomous vehicle taxis, they're probably gonna cost between 50 cents and $1 per mile, which is less than a human-driven taxi, but more than what most people are paying to operate their car now. So, and there will be many reasons that a lot of people, I think, will prefer to have their own personal self-driving car rather than rely entirely on self-driving taxis. It's much more convenient to have that car in front of your house rather than having to wait for a self-driving taxi. And in cities, you might be able to expect, say, a less than 5-minute arrival time. When you call a taxi, you'll have a self-driving taxi. If the service is very dense, it might normally arrive within 5 minutes. But if you're in a suburban or rural area, or you need a particular type of vehicle, like a van to carry a large family, or a truck to carry your sports gear, it could easily be 15, 20 minutes or even more before one of the self-driving taxis could arrive. And our analysis suggests that for a typical motorist, you're only saving money with self-driving taxis if you're driving less than, say, 6,000 annual miles. If you're a high annual mileage driver, you might as well own your own self-driving car. And there's cleaning and vandalism concerns. So the self-driving taxis will probably not be luxurious. They won't have leather seats or really good sound systems. They're going to be hardened to prevent vandalism and minimize cleaning. And so it won't be a great travel experience. Many people are proud of their cars and so prefer owning their own cars. So it's not to say that a lot of people wouldn't shift to shared autonomous taxis, but not everybody, and it's particularly in the rural and suburban areas. Optimists predict that because human error contributes to about 90% of all crashes, self-driving cars will eliminate 90% of crashes. I think that's a little optimistic. It's ignoring the additional risks that autonomous technologies introduce, things like hardware and software failures, malicious hacking, the increased risk-taking by other people on the road if they think that the self-driving cars are going to be super safe. The platooning risk. So if we are successful in organizing our roads to maximize their efficiency with these platoons, when a crash does occur, instead of it being, say, a 2 or 3 vehicle crash, it could easily be a 10 to 20 vehicle crash if all these vehicles are driving at relatively high speeds close together. And autonomous electric vehicles are likely to be driven more annual miles. It's just cheaper and easier to travel longer distances, and so there'll be more exposure. So, we need to be realistic when we predict the benefits, when we evaluate the benefits of self-driving electric cars. Another impact to consider is traffic congestion impacts. Again, optimists predict that self-driving cars will significantly reduce traffic congestion, but if you look at the fine print, that applies almost primarily to if the vehicles have their dedicated lane where they can platoon. So under most circumstances, there will be little or no reduction in traffic congestion, and especially if they induce more vehicle travel. So of course, there will be many benefits, but we need to really think about the infrastructure costs, the infrastructure requirements, and who's going to pay if we do have new autonomous vehicle lanes. Are the users going to pay a special fare? And if so, how should it be structured? Are we going to try and have cost recovery of those lanes? So looking back at my predictions of how quickly autonomous vehicles will become available, I do this analysis looking at how soon some of the benefits could occur. And so certainly if you're a long distance driver, or you're a busy person and for whatever reason you have an impairment that prevents you from driving, in the late 2020s or early 2030s, when autonomous vehicles become commercially available, even if they have some limitations on where they can drive, you could benefit. You might be willing to pay extra for a nice car that has autonomous driving capability, and say when they become commercially available, say 2030. But it'll take longer before they become ubiquitous and affordable and are able to provide other benefits like increased safety and reduced traffic congestion. So again, it's important to be realistic about how soon these benefits are likely to occur. Now, getting back to the list of new mobilities, my analysis also includes things like telework, which does provide very significant benefits like we're experiencing right now. We're able to communicate to a large group of people electronically. So you're reducing travel time and some financial costs, but there are some additional costs. The equipment costs for your high-speed internet and computers and social isolation, and it can encourage more sprawl, and it's unsuitable for many workers. For example, if somebody lives in a crowded apartment, it's difficult to participate in telework. And so it is important to take those into account. Now, here are some of the fun, exciting, what people consider the glamorous new modes, things like tunnel roads and pneumatic tube transport. And aviation innovations like air taxis, that autonomous little airplanes and helicopters that can take you from your suburban neighborhood to your downtown office, or supersonic jets. There are a number of companies that are proposing to produce private supersonic jets, and delivery drones. So when will your pizza and beer be delivered to your home by a cute little drone? Another transportation innovation is what we call mobility prioritization. So this is a set of policies and pricing systems that favor, let's call them, more resource efficient and higher value trips. So it favors freight travel and buses or high occupancy vehicles over general traffic, and allows somebody that's in a real hurry to outbid other people for those scarce traffic lanes. There are a number of ways to do this, and the prioritization, of course, also applies to curb and parking facilities. So we can start thinking, how can we extract more value from our transportation system? And this requires a set of regulations and pricing mechanisms and information services. So when you're when you're making a decision, say how to get to the airport, you would very quickly be able to see how long it would take and what it would cost to use various modes. And the same with parking. There are apps and electronic signage that can help identify the location and price of various parking facilities. So that's vehicle prioritization. And let's not forget freight. Freight represents about 10% of total vehicle travel, but about 30% of vehicle fuel consumption and emissions. And so it is very important to increase freight efficiency for many reasons. And there are many ways to do this. Everything from relying more on smaller, efficient vehicles for local deliveries to better consolidation of loads and more use of the more resource efficient modes like rail when it's more efficient than truck transport, and better delivery systems. And all of those require, or most of those require some public policy intervention to put them all together. So in my research, what I do is I rate each of those new mobilities according to various planning, you could call them planning objectives, things that we're trying to do, trying to achieve, things like increasing or changing our travel speed and travel time costs, reducing travel time costs, providing savings and affordability, effects on infrastructure costs and congestion, whether they help achieve social equity goals, health and safety goals, how they affect contagion risk, do they increase or reduce fuel consumption, energy consumption, and other resource consumptions, do they support strategic goals like creating more compact, resource efficient, accessible communities, or do they encourage sprawl? So this table very quickly illustrates the rating system that I use, and using those results, I rate the various new mobilities in terms of the degree that they help achieve these various planning objectives. And what it does show is that the resource efficient modes like active and micro modes and public transit improvements and mobility prioritization and mobility as a service, those tend to provide the greatest total benefits. Where some of the modes that get the most attention, they're considered the most glamorous, they tend to be more expensive and do less to achieve social equity and health goals. And a lot of them stimulate sprawl and contradict our strategic goals. And so they rate worse. Now, of course, you are welcome to develop your own rating system and to evaluate, to modify the evaluation approach that I used to reflect other values or other concerns. But I think most planners, most objective analysts who look at these would come to similar conclusions that some modes of travel provide, some of the new mobilities can provide much greater range of benefits. And so from a public policy perspective, can do a lot more to achieve our strategic goals than others. The key question is, to what degree do the new mobilities increase or reduce total vehicle travel? So some of them, say shared autonomous taxis, they do provide some mobility options to non-drivers, and they increase convenience and productivity, and they will generate a lot of what you could call empty backhauls, 0 passenger miles. So for a typical taxi trip generates about 2 kilometers or 2 miles of travel for every passenger mile because of those empty backhauls. They can also tend to encourage sprawl. They're making it much easier to live at the urban fringe and encouraging people to do so. And to the degree that they take over the market, they're squeezing out other modes, particularly public transit. In fact, recent studies suggest that public transit ridership has declined during the last few years, in part because of the availability of ride-hailing services. And autonomous taxis are likely to have similar effects. Now, with proper policies, if we give people incentives to choose the most efficient mode for each trip and avoid low-value vehicle travel, then these new technologies can reduce total vehicle travel and help achieve these strategic objectives. So that's the quick summary of the research in my book, of the analysis in my book. So let's summarize some of the conclusions, and then we'll go into discussion. So in terms of deployment, we could say vehicle innovations tend to be implemented more slowly than other technological change due to high cost, strict safety requirements, and slow fleet turnover. So for example, it only took about a decade to go from flip phones to most people being able to assume that most, at least in affluent countries, most people have a smartphone with a lot of capabilities. But there's a big difference between getting a smartphone and getting a self-driving, an autonomous vehicle. Vehicles typically cost about 50 times as much and last about 10 times as long as personal computers and mobile phones. And consumers seldom purchase a new vehicle simply to obtain a new technology. Most vehicle innovations are initially costly and imperfect. It usually takes decades before they are common in the fleet. And predictions that autonomous electric taxis will soon be cheap and ubiquitous and replace most private vehicle travel are mostly made by people with financial interests in the industry, and I think there's good reasons to be skeptical. In terms of the costs and benefits, there's considerable uncertainty about some of the new mobility's benefits, costs, and travel impacts. The advocates often exaggerate the net benefits by ignoring some of the new costs and risks and the rebound effects, that is the additional vehicle travel that they generate, and the harms to people, for example, if you're a bicyclist or a pedestrian, and the risks that self-driving cars and the increased vehicle travel that they can generate could be very negative. And so some new mobility support, but others contradict our social equity goals. Many potential benefits depend on how new mobilities are implemented and regulated and priced. So the devil is in the detail. Many of the glamorous modes are not necessarily the most useful or beneficial or fun. Think about the Hyperloop, the pneumatic tube transport. You'll get into this capsule, but it has no windows, and the capsules are usually designed as being fairly small with 1 or 2 dozen passengers. Probably no services because they're going to accelerate at a high rate and decelerate at a high rate, and so you wouldn't want a drink in your hand, and there will be no washroom, and their forces will make some people nauseous. And so what will it really be like to travel in, say, a self-driving car where there's some garbage or suspicious stains or odors left by the previous occupant, or there could be, you're in a Hyperloop with sitting next to a crying baby for half an hour when it accelerates at high G forces. So my conclusion is the total benefits tend to be greatest for the affordable, resource-efficient modes. Expensive, resource-intensive modes tend to provide smaller benefits, impose greater costs and risks, and tend to be less equitable. So there are some policy recommendations. These are not unique to me. Many other experts have reached similar conclusions. That it is going to be very important to test and regulate the new technologies for safety and efficiency, to critically evaluate all the impacts, including indirect and long-term effects, support active and multi-modes and micro-modes for local trips. So don't forget the small stuff. That is walking, bicycling, e-bikes, e-scooters, cargo bikes, and high-quality public transit on major corridors. Those are going to be are likely to provide the greatest total benefits. Applying new technologies to improve those modes tends to provide the greatest total benefits, according to my research. It's important to take advantage of some of the benefits, like reducing parking requirements. If people are relying more on shared vehicles and active and micro modes and public transit, it makes no sense to force people to pay for costly parking facilities that they won't need. And it's going to be important to plan and price to favor the efficient modes and to prevent induced travel, and to recover the costs of, in particular, the large, expensive infrastructure that some of these new modes are going to require. The terminals for air taxis, the additional lanes for self-driving cars. There's little justification for people that don't use those new modes to have to cross-subsidize them. So that's a lot of information, I know, in a short period of time. If you're interested in finding out more, buy my book, but also visit our website, Victoria Transport Policy Institute, VTPI, which has many free reports that go into detail about some of the information that I just presented. And of course, I'm always interested in getting feedback. So we will now, I think, go into our discussion. And if I'm looking forward to hearing from the audience. And if anybody has any additional questions, you can send me an email in the future directly to our website. So thank you very much, Robert. I'll leave it to you.
Great. Thanks very much, Todd. Thanks for the really provocative presentation. I like the way that you kind of get beyond the hype. Here at Eno, obviously we deal a lot with a lot of folks calling up asking just general questions about things that are very popular and in the news. And I like the way that you've gotten past some of the broad strokes and into the how and the why, right? It's a really interesting part of this discussion. Send your questions in. We've got a whole bunch here that are starting to come in now. So let me start with moderator prerogative and ask one. I've read through the book, which I would encourage folks to pick up. It's a great read. It's very, very well written. It's not too long, so good for the summertime. One of the most, I think, important things in the book is that you talk about the difference between mobility and accessibility, and I feel like that undergirds a lot of what you evaluate in here. Can you weigh in a little bit more on that, on the difference there and why that's so important?
Right. So that's the real foundational issue of discussion, and that is that until fairly recently, we assumed that transportation improvement meant traveling faster and farther, that is mobility. In the last couple of decades, there's been a major rethink among transportation professionals and policy analysts, recognizing that mobility is not an end in itself. The ultimate goal of most travel is access to services and activities. And there are many factors that affect accessibility, including, of course, your mobility. So great, faster does provide benefits, but also the quality of other modes. So is it easy to get around by walking and bicycling, by the slower modes, by public transportation? Also, very important is land use. So what is the distance between activities and how far do you have to travel? And that recognizes that a more compact community can provide many benefits. And then there's some subtle things. There is user information and affordability and convenience. The ease, for example, of getting to a bus stop or a train station and buying a ticket, knowing how to get around. Those are all components of accessibility. Now, Robert, I know you've been in the center of a lot of this discussion, and you know that just in the last couple of years, some terrific new research and publications and mapping tools, GIS mapping tools have become available that allow us to analyze true accessibility, multimodal accessibility. The Brookings Institute has a major program. A project that I've worked on developed access evaluation tools. I'll try and put some links in the chat box, but in any case, this is the hot issue among transportation planners. It does recognize, in particular, that many of the things that we did in the past to accelerate mobility, to make it especially automobile travel or air travel faster, actually reduced other forms of accessibility. If we widen a highway and it makes it faster to drive, but it makes it more difficult to get across there by walking and bicycling. It's a barrier. And similarly, decisions such as should we put in a bus lane or a bike lane are really about trade-offs between different forms of accessibility. So fortunately, this all fits together. That we can ask, to what degree do the new mobilities, does a particular new mobility help increase true overall accessibility, and recognize different people are at different stages in understanding this concept. So it's perfectly possible that on Monday you'll have a meeting with a bunch of old school people that assume transportation improvements means reducing traffic congestion and accelerating car travel. And on Tuesday, you meet with a bunch of land use plan, smart growth advocates, and they're saying, no, we want to improve, we want to create more compact communities where you don't have to travel as far. And you might meet on Wednesday with a bunch of health professionals, and they're asking, how can we create communities where it's normal for people to get exercise, the exercise they need through local travel? And that's another aspect of accessibility.
Thank you for that. I feel like it's important to get that out of the way up front. I think that that does seem to be the basis for a lot of what you analyze in the book, and it gets to a whole bunch of the questions that are in here. Let me try to summarize. I think one general one. People want to get into very specific, all their different comments about each mobility. But let me ask. So doesn't this all basically comes down to public policy to begin with, right? It's not really the technology itself, but how the framework for it is laid out. So in other words, in the absence of a policy framework, right, a bike share company would put bikes in high traffic areas or touristy areas and may not be focused on social equity, for example, right? It is the public policies that are driving a lot of that. We see some of the stats for bike share anyway. So is there a way, I mean, doesn't this all then come down to really your policy recommendations? How do we craft the future we want with these new technologies rather than the technologies themselves being good or bad or indifferent?
Right. So of course the advocates, the people in the, let's call, the autonomous vehicle or air taxi industries or drone industries, they legitimately focus on the benefits, and particularly the consumer benefits. They're trying to sell a product, and that's perfectly legitimate as long as the rest of us are a little bit skeptical and insist upon a comprehensive analysis of all of the impacts and develop policies that are not simply consumer benefit maximizing, but are community benefit maximizing. And that means the ability to be discerning and say no, or it's not necessarily saying no, but it's limiting. Here's an example. Let's say your neighbor is in the habit of getting pizza and beer delivered at their late night parties in their backyard. What do you think your municipal government regulations on drone delivery should be? Should they limit the time? Should they say no drone deliveries after 10 o'clock or 9 o'clock or whatever, so it's not waking you up in the late at night? Should they emphasize high value trips? Should your municipal government say it's fine to deliver critical medicine and essential goods by drone, but let's not use it for pizza and beer? That is the dangers of the loss, the noise, and the danger of one of those crashing on your head are too great to allow it to be used for low value trips. So that I think is the critical perspective that communities, that is, any level of government needs to apply to these new mobilities, is to think critically about the true benefits and costs and how they align with the community's strategic goals, and to be very strict to say this new mobility might benefit some people, but it just doesn't fit in with our strategic goals of creating a more affordable, healthy, efficient transportation system and reducing sprawl and encouraging compact multimodal neighborhood development. So that, I think, is the critical message. Again, my message is not new, although I think my analysis is a little bit more comprehensive than anything else I've seen. And it really, I'm not telling you how everybody should think about these things, but I am suggesting that any planner or policy analyst or somebody who's involved in these decisions should apply a comprehensive analysis framework such as the one I developed, and maybe modify it to your own particular needs. So what do you think, Robert? Is there a great need for, is new mobility impact analysis going to be the next emerging field for policy analysts and planners?
Well, I'm glad you brought that up. I'm glad you raised that. Of all the questions that are in here, I think from folks, that your slide, the analysis summary table slide, I think is how it was titled. I think it's engendered the most comments and questions from folks, because I think it gets to just what you were talking about, right? It's not necessarily the technologies themselves; it's how they're applied and everything that you just laid out. You know, your UAS, the uncrewed aerial systems comment's a good one. Because you're right, we could use this in ways that are actually supporting all kinds of different social goals, you know, delivering medicine to rural areas and things like that. But you rank it as a -3, and you have you know, +3 for things like micromobility and bike share and things like that. So that's the thing I think that's got most folks interested here. So can you drill in a little bit more on that? Did you think about weighting any of those factors? Right, and you had, I think it's very provocative the way that you laid out all those different categories. Do you find that some are more important than others, or is it, as you said, is it up to folks to do their own analysis based on their own design?
Right. So I'm sure, Robert, over your career and the career of almost anybody involved in transportation analysis, you're very aware that how the analysis is structured can have a huge effect on on what your conclusions are. And so, and we also are very aware of how difficult it is to know what the future is going to be. You know, what will the health and safety impacts of a particular mode be, you know, overall, and things like that. So I'm the first to admit that my analysis has simplified very complex issues. And I'm not in any way saying that, for example, those resource-intensive modes that rank poorly are bad. But what we can say with a certain amount of confidence is that they're costly. So if you were to have, let's say, if we were to rely on air taxis, that is, little self-driving airplanes that you know, can fly 20 to 60 miles or so. That's the concept that's widely promoted by some people in those industries. And they're envisioning that we will organize our lives around that a lot of people would move out to the urban fringe and rely on an air taxi to take them to work or go shopping or whatever. Okay, that's fine. But you can say with a certain amount of confidence that that air taxis will never be really cheap. That their resources are intensive, and they will inevitably create some external costs. That is, you know, the air taxi people, they explain to me, oh yeah, we can design the helicopter wing or the blades to minimize noise so they're even less noisy than a motorcycle. And we're going to allow, since we allow motorcycles, it should be perfectly fine that we allow air taxis that are even less noisy than a motorcycle. Okay, how many air taxis flying over your house from, say, 6 in the morning till 10 at night would you want if they're quieter than a motorcycle? Is that reassuring? My point is simply, let's put all these impacts on the table, and each community should develop its framework, and that reflect its values, its priorities. And I think if you do that, you're going to end up with a matrix similar to what I developed. It just might have somewhat different values. But don't we should never fall for the mistake of only looking at the benefits and ignoring the costs, or only looking at impacts on one group and ignoring the impacts on the other. That's really the key of what I would call comprehensive analysis.
Yeah, I think that's right. There's a lot of comments in the questions box here about that very point. Let me can do another general kind of question. Then other questions around planning for social equity. So, and it may be an unfair question here, but so how do you do that? How do you plan for these new mobility options with social equity in mind? How exactly does that happen? There's general comments about that.
Robert, you and I have been working on transportation equity analysis for a couple decades at least. I'm proud that one of my reports on that subject, called Evaluating Transportation Equity, has been widely cited. It lays out what I consider to be the general framework, and someday we should have another webinar on that subject. But to put it very briefly, you can identify some social equity objectives. You're not necessarily saying you're taking into account every social equity impact, but you can say that to achieve multiple social equity goals, that is to help people with disabilities and low incomes and other and make sure that we're being fair to everyone. You can say we want a level playing field between different modes, unless there's a specific reason to subsidize it, and that we would favor travel modes that are more affordable over more expensive modes. And we're going to favor the modes that accommodate non-drivers, so that somebody that cannot or should not drive or prefers not to drive gets their fair share of the transportation resource investments. And you can say we're going to have special targets for things like universal design. So we're ensuring our vehicles and our transportation facilities accommodate people with disabilities and other special needs. And you could incorporate special targets for example, affirmative action or other very specific social goals. But applying, simply using some of the objectives like, is it more affordable? Does it increase affordability? Does it serve non-drivers? Does it create a more level playing field between the haves and the have-nots, between people who can drive and people who can't drive? Does it reduce the external impacts, in particular the negative impacts that motor vehicle travel imposes on active transportation and on disadvantaged neighborhoods? Those are the types of equity objectives or impacts that I think we can work with. They are practical ways to reflect a broad range of equity goals. So I think equity analysis is very important, and I do a lot of work on it. And I think there's a lot of progress that we can make as transportation professionals. And so hopefully, maybe that'll be my next book.
And I like that point. I think the intentionality is a big piece of it. It's not an if you build it, they will come scenario. You can build all the bike share and trains that you want, but unless you're being intentional, it's not going to happen by itself. We have time for just one more question, and I'd be remiss if I didn't ask it because a lot of folks are interested. Maybe it's because of the big infrastructure bill that's moving its way through federal Washington today. But you had your comments on what you called it, but around Hyperloop, essentially. Do you feel different about high-speed rail? This is a question that comes up a lot around here. Intercity rail, maybe not as a new mobility, but as an option, more viable option than Hyperloop.
Sure. Well, it is a challenging question. Like any new network, the potential costs sound terrific, tremendous, right? So we're talking about more than $100 billion, a lot of money to develop a high-speed rail network. So the question is that cost effective, and what are the impacts? For example, does it substitute for conventional? Is it substituting for bus and train travel, or is it substituting for air travel? Would it reduce high altitude carbon emissions, and therefore those very harmful emissions associated with air travel? So I'm not against high-speed rail, but I sure would like North America to invest in basic public transportation, rail and bus service. You know, just to put this into perspective, my family's been car-free for the last decade, more than a decade. So I personally experience the non-automotive transportation system here in North America frequently. And I can, you know, for anybody that doesn't know it, it's terrible. It ranges from bad to terrible. If you want to take a holiday in, you know, to a nearby city, often there's no rail, and the worst and the best you can find is maybe 2 or 3 bus trips a day. We could do much better. You know, there are plenty, and a lot of it has to do with these incentives. The current incentives encourage people to either drive a car or fly in an airplane, and we have failed to give public transportation equal consideration. So whether or not the United States invests in high-speed rail, and I personally would support it, but I can understand the skepticism. I think there's a tremendous return on investment from improving and encouraging public transit. And just for fun, if anybody's interested, I'm going to post in the chat box the new dialogue between myself and transit opponent Randall O'Toole, who he and I have a debate about the future of public transportation. So let me put this in the chat box, and anybody wants to see my how I respond to transit skeptic, you'll understand. I do think that high quality public transit provides tremendous return on investment, and speed is only one aspect of that. I want nice stations, comfortable vehicles, frequent service, great integration into your local transportation system. Those are the features that I'm most concerned about. Speed is great, but only incidental. What do you think, Robert?
Sorry, I was on mute. Yeah, I think there's a lot of focus on the user experience now, and it's very consistent with all of that. And I would encourage folks to take a look at that discussion, and certainly take Todd up on his offer to contact him and give him feedback. You know, we didn't get to all the questions, a ton of great questions in here. We just didn't have time for it, but we're at the top of the hour. So I want to thank you all for joining and for your great questions, and to Todd for participating in this. He certainly, as you can tell, he's certainly not a Luddite, but I think asking these questions is really important, especially for some of these things that are much further along. There is a revolution in transportation technology happening right now, but there are a lot of questions we certainly do need to get right. So thank you all again very much. If you want more information about Eno, including our ongoing webinar series, you can check out our website, www.enotrans.org. We also have 2 major upcoming events I wanted to draw your attention to: our Centennial Institute, which is happening virtually in mid-September, and our Symposium on Transit Cost and Project Delivery, which is happening also virtually in October. Information about both of those is up on our website. Both tremendous events that they're going to sell out, so I would encourage you to sign up as soon as you can. And while you're there, you should check out Eno Transportation Weekly, which is an invaluable resource on all things transportation, especially with this big federal conversation on infrastructure that we're having right now. So again, my thanks to Todd. It's really great to see you again, and to all of you for joining us. Stay safe, everybody. Have a great afternoon.